There was a place where two rivers met the earth and made it soft, where water moved slowly through flatlands under an open sky, where the first cities rose from mud and reeds, and people began to write their names into clay. This place had no single name for thousands of years. It was simply the land, the place between the rivers. Later, others would call it Mesopotamia. But long before that word existed, people lived there. They planted barley. They built homes. They watched the stars and tried to understand the gods. They slept under the same moon we see now, though the world around them was entirely different. This is Archive of Rest, a place for slow history, quiet nights, and unhurried listening. You don't need to remember everything here. You don't need to take notes. This is just a voice in the dark, walking with you through time. We're going to move through the entire span of ancient Mesopotamia. Not quickly, not with urgency, but carefully, the way you might walk. Through an old ruin at dusk, when the light is fading and the stones are still warm. We'll begin long before the first empires, before kings and laws and temples. We'll start with the people who had no written language, no cities, no armies. Just the rivers, just the land, and we'll move forward slowly, century by century, watching as villages became cities, as cities became kingdoms, as kingdoms became empires. We'll see writing appear. We'll see gods take shape. We'll see the first laws carved into stone, the first libraries built, the first maps of the heavens drawn on clay. But we'll also see the ordinary moments, the way people slept, the way they lit their homes at night, the way they spoke to their children, buried their dead, and tried to make sense of a world that felt vast and uncertain. Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization. That phrase is used so often it loses meaning. But what it really means is this: it was one of the first places where people stopped moving, where they stayed in one place long enough to build something that lasted, long enough to argue about borders and water rights, long enough to wonder what happens after death, and to write those questions down. The rivers that made this possible were the Tigris and the Euphrates. They flowed south from the mountains, through a wide plain, and eventually into the sea. The land between them was flat and hot. In summer, it baked. In winter, it flooded. But when the floods receded, they left behind rich, dark soil. That soil made everything possible. It wasn't an easy place to live. There were no forests for timber, no stone for building, no metal in the ground. Everything had to be made from what the rivers provided: mud, reeds, water. And so the people learned to shape mud into bricks, to weave reeds into walls, to dig channels and move water where they needed it. They learned to work with what they had, and in doing so, they built a world. This world would rise and fall many times. Empires would come and go, languages would change, gods would be renamed, forgotten, remembered again. But the rivers kept flowing, the soil kept renewing, and people kept returning to this place generation after generation, because it gave them what they needed to survive. We're going to watch that entire process unfold, not as a list of kings and battles, though those will appear, but as a long, continuous story of people trying to live, trying to build, trying to understand. Some of what we know comes from the ruins themselves, from the walls and temples and canals that still exist, buried under sand. Some comes from the clay tablets they left behind, covered in wedge-shaped marks that took centuries to decipher. And some comes from the stories they told, passed down and rewritten so many times that we can no longer separate myth from memory. But all of it, even the myths, tells us something true about how they saw the world, about what mattered to them, about the questions they asked in the dark, when the work was done and the night stretched out ahead. So we'll begin where they began, not with kings or cities, but with the first people who looked at this land and decided to stay, who planted seeds and waited, who built homes and raised children, who had no idea they were starting something that would last for thousands of years. The sun is setting over the rivers now. The air is cooling. Somewhere in the distance, smoke rises from a fire. Someone is cooking. Someone is coming home. This is where it starts. The first people came to the rivers when the world was still warming. The ice had retreated north. The climate had shifted. And across the wide belt of land that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, something new was happening. Plants were growing in predictable patterns. Animals were gathering in herds, and people were beginning to notice. They had been wanderers before this, following game, following seasons, moving when the food moved. But now, in certain places, it became possible to stay. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was one of those places. It wasn't the easiest place to settle. The rivers flooded unpredictably. The summers were brutal. There were no natural defenses, no mountains or forests to hide in. Just open plain, stretching in every direction. But the soil was rich, and the rivers, for all their danger, provided everything else. Fish, reeds for building, clay for shaping, water for drinking and for crops. So people stayed. At first, they built small camps, temporary shelters made of reeds and mud, clustered near the riverbanks. They planted wild grasses and waited to see what would grow. They learned which plants could be eaten, which could be stored, which would grow again if you saved the seeds. This was not a sudden transformation. It took generations, centuries even. There was no moment when someone decided to invent agriculture. It was a slow accumulation of knowledge, a gradual shift from gathering to planting, from following to staying. The earliest settlements were tiny, a few families maybe, a dozen people at most. They lived in round huts with walls made of woven reeds, plastered with mud to keep out the wind. The roofs were thatched with dried grasses. Inside, there was a fire pit, a few storage jars, sleeping mats made of woven fiber. At night, they would gather around the fire. The children would sleep close to their mothers. The men would sit and talk quietly, or sharpen tools, or stare into the flames. Outside, the darkness was complete. No streetlights, no distant glow of cities, just the stars and the sound of the river moving past. They slept when it got dark. There was no reason to stay awake, no candles to read by, no work that required light. Sleep came with the sunset and lasted until dawn. Deep, uninterrupted sleep, shaped by the rhythms of the sun. Their days were built around survival, but not in the desperate way we imagine. There was time to sit, time to watch children play, time to make things beautiful for no practical reason. They carved patterns into bone. They shaped clay into small figures. They pierced shells and strung them into necklaces. These weren't necessities. They were expressions of something else, a desire to make meaning, to leave a mark. The dead were buried carefully, not thrown away, not abandoned. They were placed in the ground beneath the floors of homes, or just outside the settlement, with their belongings beside them. Pottery, tools, beads. as if they might need these things wherever they were going. This suggests they believed in something beyond the visible world, some continuation, some other place where the dead still existed, still needed food and tools and comfort. But they left no written record of what they believed. No prayers, no myths, no explanations. Just the graves themselves, and the care with which they were made. The crops they planted were simple. Barley and wheat, mostly. Emmer and einkorn, the wild ancestors of modern grains. These plants had small seeds and tough husks, but they grew reliably in the river soil. Each year, the people saved the largest seeds and planted them again. Slowly, over many generations, the plants changed. The seeds grew larger. The husks grew thinner. The plants became dependent on human care. This was domestication. Not a conscious process, but an inevitable one. The plants and the people shaped each other. They also kept animals. At first, they hunted wild sheep and goats in the hills to the north. But over time, they began to keep some of the young animals, feeding them, protecting them, letting them breed. The animals grew tamer. Their horns changed shape. Their coats grew thicker. They became livestock. Pigs came later, then cattle. Each animal brought new possibilities: milk, wool, labor, the ability to carry heavy loads or pull plows through hard soil, but it also brought new responsibilities. Animals had to be fed, watered, protected from predators. They tied people to the land even more firmly than crops did. The settlements grew slowly. As families had children, and those children survived, the population increased. More huts were built. More land was cleared. The villages spread outward from the riverbanks, following the channels and irrigation ditches that brought water to the fields. Irrigation was one of the great innovations of this period. The rivers flooded in spring, but by summer the fields were dry. So, the people dug channels to carry water from the river to the crops. Simple ditches at first, just deep enough to guide the flow. But over time, these channels became more complex. Branching networks that could water entire fields, controlled by simple gates made of wood and mud. This required cooperation. One family couldn't dig a canal alone. It took many people working together, agreeing on where the water should go and how it should be divided. This was the beginning of something larger than family, the beginning of community. Disputes must have arisen. Who controlled the water? Who got to plant near the main channel? Who had to settle for the dry edges of the fields? We have no record of how these questions were answered, but the fact that the settlements survived suggests they found ways to resolve them. Perhaps there were elders who made decisions. Perhaps there were councils. Perhaps it was simply understood that certain families had certain rights, passed down through generations. We don't know. But some form of social order must have existed, or the system would have collapsed. The villages were not isolated. People traveled between them, following the rivers or the old migration routes. They traded goods: obsidian from the northern mountains, shells from the southern coast, pottery and grain and woven textiles. These exchanges created relationships, alliances, marriages between villages, a web of connection that stretched across the entire region. Language must have been crucial to this. We don't know what languages they spoke. The earliest written records wouldn't appear for thousands of years, but they must have had words for the things that mattered: river, seed, flood, home, child, sky, death. And they must have had stories, ways of explaining the world, why the rivers flooded, where the sun went at night, what happened to people after they died. These stories would have been told around fires, passed from parents to children. changing slightly with each telling. Some of these stories may have survived, transformed, and rewritten into the myths we know from later periods. The story of the flood. The story of the first humans made from clay. The story of the gods who shaped the world and then withdrew, leaving humans to manage on their own. But in this early period, there were no temples, no priests, no formal religion, just the quiet sense that the world was full of forces beyond human control. The river that gave life could also destroy. The sun that ripened the crops could also scorch them. The rain that watered the fields could fail to come. People made offerings, small gifts left at the edge of fields or near the river. Grain, bread, beer once they learned to brew it. These weren't elaborate rituals, just gestures of respect, acknowledgement that they depended on forces they couldn't command. At night, they looked up at the stars and saw patterns. The same patterns we see now, though they gave them different names. They noticed that certain stars appeared at certain times of year, that the moon changed shape in a regular cycle, that the sun rose and set in slightly different places as the seasons turned. This knowledge was practical. It helped them know when to plant, when to harvest, when the floods would come. But it was also something more, a way of feeling connected to the cosmos, a sense that the sky and the earth were part of the same system, and that humans had a place within it. The nights were long in winter, the days were short. People stayed inside, close to the fire, working on tasks that didn't require daylight. Weaving, carving, repairing tools, telling stories. Children learned by watching. There were no schools, no formal instruction. You learned to plant by planting, to weave by weaving, to shape clay by shaping it. Knowledge was passed down through demonstration and practice embedded in the rhythm of daily life, and when the work was done, when the fire burned low and the children were asleep, the adults would sit in the darkness and rest, not thinking about the future, not worrying about what might come, just present in the moment, in the warmth of the fire, in the sound of breathing, in the knowledge that tomorrow would come and they would face it when it did. This was life before cities, before writing, before kings and laws and temples. It was simple, but it wasn't easy. It required constant attention, constant work, constant adaptation to the rhythms of the land and the seasons. But it was also stable. For hundreds of years, these villages existed in roughly the same form, growing slowly, changing gradually, building a foundation that would eventually support something much larger. They didn't know they were building a civilization. They were just trying to survive, trying to raise their children, trying to make it through another year. But in doing so, they created the conditions for everything that would come after. The cities, the empires, the written word. All of it began here, in these small villages by the rivers, with people who had no grand ambitions, who simply wanted to stay. The rivers kept flowing, the seasons kept turning, and the people kept planting, kept building, kept passing their knowledge down to the next generation. For now, that was enough. Something changed around 6,000 years ago. The villages grew larger. The irrigation systems grew more complex. The population increased. And at some point, in the southern part of Mesopotamia, the settlements crossed a threshold. They became something new. They became cities. This didn't happen everywhere at once. It happened first in the south, in the region that would later be called Sumer. The land there was flat and marshy, crisscrossed with channels and waterways. The soil was extraordinarily fertile, but it required constant management. The water had to be controlled, directed, distributed, and that required organization on a scale that had never existed before. The first cities had names: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. These weren't just large villages. They were centers of population with thousands of people living in close proximity. They had walls. They had monumental buildings. They had specialized workers who didn't farm, who spent their days doing other things. Making pottery, weaving cloth, working metal, keeping records. Uruk was the largest. At its height, it may have held 40,000 people, an almost unimaginable number for the time. The city covered several square miles, with dense neighborhoods of mud brick houses separated by narrow streets. At the center stood a massive temple complex raised on a platform above the surrounding buildings. This temple was dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. It was the heart of the city, not just a religious center, but an economic one. The temple owned land. It employed workers. It stored grain and distributed rations. It was, in many ways, the institution that made the city possible. The temple complexes grew out of earlier traditions. For generations, villages had built shrines, small structures where offerings could be made, where the community could gather for rituals. But as the settlements grew, so did the shrines. They were rebuilt, expanded, raised higher. Each generation added to what came before, until the buildings became massive. These weren't just places of worship, they were administrative centers. The priests who ran them were also managers, overseeing the labor of hundreds or thousands of people. They decided when to plant and when to harvest. They collected taxes in the form of grain and livestock. They organized the digging of canals and the maintenance of irrigation systems. And they kept records. This is where writing began, not as literature, not as a way to record stories or ideas, but as a tool for accounting, a way to track goods and labor. The earliest writing was done on clay tablets, small rectangles of soft clay marked with a reed stylus. The marks were simple at first, just pictograms. A drawing of a sheep meant sheep. A drawing of grain meant grain. Numbers were represented by different-sized marks. These tablets recorded transactions: 10 sheep delivered to the temple, 20 workers assigned to dig a canal, 50 jars of oil stored in the warehouse. Mundane details. But they were the beginning of something profound. Over time, the pictograms became more abstract. The drawings were simplified into combinations of wedge-shaped marks, pressed into the clay at different angles. This is what we call cuneiform. Wedge writing. It was faster than drawing pictures, and it could represent more complex ideas. Eventually, the system expanded beyond simple accounting. It began to represent sounds, not just objects. This meant it could be used to write names, to record spoken language, to capture things that couldn't be drawn. The people who learned this system were called scribes. It was a specialized skill requiring years of training. Scribes learned by copying. They would practice the same signs over and over on clay tablets that would later be smoothed and reused. They memorized long lists of words and their corresponding signs. They learned the formulas for different types of documents: contracts, receipts, letters. Being a scribe was a path to status. It meant you didn't have to work in the fields. You sat in the shade, in the temple complex, or in the household of a wealthy family, and you wrote. You kept track of things. You made the system work. But most people in the cities couldn't read or write. They were farmers, laborers, craftspeople. They lived in small houses made of mud brick, clustered in neighborhoods. The houses were simple, 1 or 2 rooms with a flat roof that could be used for sleeping in hot weather, a courtyard where cooking was done, storage jars for grain and oil, sleeping mats that were rolled up during the day. The streets were narrow and winding. There was no central plan, no grid. The city had grown organically, houses built wherever there was space, paths worn by foot traffic over generations. In some areas, the streets were so narrow that 2 people could barely pass each other. There was no sewage system. Waste was thrown into the streets or into pits. The smell must have been overwhelming, especially in summer. Disease would have been common. Life expectancy was short. Many children didn't survive to adulthood. Women often died in childbirth. Even those who survived childhood might only live to 40 or 50. But despite the hardships, the cities thrived. They grew. They attracted people from the surrounding countryside who came seeking work or opportunity, or simply the safety of walls and numbers. The cities were noisy. During the day, the streets were full of activity. Merchants calling out their wares, children playing, animals being driven to market. The sound of hammers on metal, of looms clacking, of potter's wheels spinning. The smell of bread baking, of beer brewing, of animals and sweat and smoke. At night, the cities grew quieter. Most people went to sleep when it got dark. Oil lamps were expensive, and most families couldn't afford to burn them for long. So the streets emptied. The only light came from the temple complex, where fires burned through the night, tended by priests. The wealthy had larger houses, multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard, servants to do the cooking and cleaning, fine pottery and woven textiles, jewelry made of gold and lapis lazuli, imported from distant lands. They ate better food, meat more often, dates and figs, bread made from finer flour. But even the wealthy were subject to the same uncertainties as everyone else, the same diseases, the same floods, the same dependence on the harvest. Wealth provided comfort, but it didn't provide immunity from the fundamental precariousness of life. The cities were ruled by figures called ensi, or lugal. These words are often translated as governor or king, but their exact meaning is unclear. They seem to have been both religious and political leaders. They represented the gods. They led the city in war. They oversaw major building projects. But their power was not absolute. They worked alongside the temple priests, who controlled vast resources. They had to maintain the support of the city's elite families, and they were expected to provide for the common people, to ensure the irrigation systems were maintained, to store grain for times of famine, to protect the city from enemies. War was becoming more common. As the cities grew, they came into conflict over resources, water rights, farmland, trade routes. Armies were raised from the population. Farmers and laborers who would set aside their tools and take up weapons when needed. The weapons were simple: spears, axes, bows. Soldiers wore no armor, or at most a leather cap and a cloak. Battles were brutal and short. The goal was usually not to annihilate the enemy, but to force them to submit, to pay tribute, to acknowledge the superiority of your city's god, because the gods were central to everything. Each city had its patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Ur belonged to Nana, the moon god. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of water and wisdom. These gods were not distant or abstract. They were present in the city, living in the temple, receiving offerings. making their will known through priests and omens. The gods were powerful, but they were also capricious. They had emotions. They could be pleased or angered. They fought among themselves. They made mistakes. In many ways, they were like humans, but magnified. Immortal and powerful, but not all-knowing or perfectly just. People made offerings to stay in the gods' favor. Bread, beer, meat, incense. These offerings were brought to the temple and presented to the statue of the god, which was treated as if it were alive. It was dressed in fine clothes. It was given food and drink. It was carried in processions through the city on festival days. The priests ate the food after it had been offered. This was understood. The god consumed the spiritual essence, and the physical substance was left for the priests. It was a practical system. The temple received a constant stream of goods, which supported the priests and the temple workers and could be redistributed in times of need. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons, the new year, the harvest, the flooding of the rivers. These were times when the entire city participated. Work stopped. People gathered in the streets and in the temple courtyards. There was music, dancing, feasting, a temporary suspension of the normal order. These festivals reinforced the sense of community. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves, that they belonged to this city under the protection of this god, sharing in the same fate. But daily life was mostly routine. People woke at dawn. They worked. They ate simple meals, barley bread, onions, dates, beer, which was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than the beer we know today. In the evening, they returned home. They sat with their families. They slept. Children played in the streets. They had simple toys, clay figurines, balls made of rags. They helped with small tasks, carrying water, watching younger siblings, feeding animals. By the time they were 10 or 12, they were doing adult work. There was no concept of childhood as a separate stage of life. You were small, and then you grew, and then you worked. If you survived, you married. You had children of your own. You grew old if you were lucky, and then you died, and you were buried, and life continued without you. The dead were still buried with care, often beneath the floors of houses, so they remained close to the family. Sometimes in cemeteries outside the city walls. They were given grave goods, pottery, tools, food for the journey to the underworld. The underworld was called Kur. It was imagined as a dark, dusty place beneath the earth. Not a place of punishment exactly, just a dim reflection of life. The dead existed there as shadows, eating dust, drinking muddy water. It was not a fate to look forward to, but it was inevitable. Everyone went there, regardless of how they had lived. This belief shaped how people thought about life. There was no promise of reward in the afterlife, no heaven for the virtuous. So the focus was on this life, on building something that would last, on being remembered, on leaving children who would speak your name and make offerings at your grave. The cities were experiments in living. They required new forms of cooperation, new ways of organizing labor, new methods of resolving disputes. They created wealth and inequality. They made possible art and literature and science, but they also created new forms of suffering, crowding, disease, exploitation. And yet people kept coming. The cities kept growing, because despite everything, they offered something the villages couldn't: opportunity, diversity, the chance to be part of something larger, the sense that here, in these crowded streets, in the shadow of the temple, something important was happening. The scribes kept writing. The priests kept making offerings. The workers kept digging canals and planting fields. The potters kept shaping clay. The weavers kept working their looms. And at night, when the work was done, people lay down in their small houses and slept. They dreamed, perhaps, of better harvests, of healthy children, of peace, of the gods looking favorably on their city. The stars turned overhead, the rivers flowed, and in the morning the city woke again and the cycle continued. This was Sumer, the first civilization, the first time humans had organized themselves on this scale, the first time they had built something that would outlast any individual life. They didn't know they were making history. They were just living. But in living, they created the foundation for everything that would follow. The gods were everywhere in Sumer. They were in the temple, of course. But they were also in the fields, in the rivers, in the wind that blew across the plain. They were in the clay that people shaped into bricks, in the grain that grew in the furrows, in the stars that wheeled overhead at night. The world was not divided into sacred and secular. Everything was sacred. Everything was connected to the divine. But the gods were not simple. They were not all-powerful or all-knowing. They had personalities, preferences, rivalries. They made mistakes. They changed their minds. They could be generous or cruel depending on their mood. The Sumerians understood this. They didn't expect the gods to be perfect. They expected them to be powerful, and they tried to stay on their good side. Each city had its patron deity, but the pantheon was shared across all of Sumer. The same gods appeared in different cities, though their importance varied. An was the sky god, the father of the gods, but he was distant. He rarely intervened in human affairs. Enlil was the god of wind and storm, powerful and sometimes frightening. Enki was the god of water and wisdom, clever and helpful to humans. Inanna was the goddess of love and war, passionate and unpredictable. There were many others. Nanna, the moon god. Utu, the sun god. Ninhursag, the mother goddess. Each had their own domain, their own stories, their own temples. The temples were called ziggurats. These were massive stepped pyramids, built from millions of mud bricks. They rose above the flat landscape, visible for miles. At the top was a shrine, a small room where the god was believed to dwell. Building a ziggurat was an enormous undertaking. It required the labor of thousands of people over many years. Workers had to make the bricks one by one, shaping mud and straw, and leaving them to dry in the sun. They had to carry these bricks to the construction site. They had to stack them carefully, layer upon layer, following a plan that existed only in the minds of the architects. Why did they do this? Why invest so much effort in a building that served no practical purpose? Because the ziggurat was the link between earth and heaven. It was the place where the god descended to meet with humans. It was the center of the city, the source of its prosperity and protection. To build a ziggurat was to honor the god, to demonstrate devotion, to ensure the god's continued favor. The priests who served in these temples were powerful figures. They were intermediaries between the gods and the people. They performed the daily rituals. They interpreted omens. They advised the rulers. They controlled vast amounts of wealth. The rituals were elaborate. Each morning, the statue of the god was awakened. It was washed. It was dressed in fresh clothes. It was given food and drink. Hymns were sung. Incense was burned. The priests performed these actions with great care, following procedures that had been established generations earlier. The statue itself was treated as if it were alive. It was not just a representation of the god. It was the god in physical form. When the statue was damaged or worn, it had to be ritually killed before a new one could be made. The old statue was buried with ceremony as if it were a body. This might seem strange to us, but for the Sumerians it made perfect sense. The gods were real. They had needs. They required care. And in return, they provided protection and prosperity. Omens were taken very seriously. The priests studied the world for signs of the gods' intentions. They examined the livers of sacrificed animals, looking for irregularities. They watched the movements of the stars and planets. They interpreted dreams. They observed unusual events: a two-headed calf, a sudden storm, a flight of birds in an unexpected direction. All of these things were messages. The gods were speaking, if you knew how to listen. And the priests claimed to know how to listen. This gave them enormous influence. If the priests said the omens were unfavorable, a military campaign might be postponed. If they said the gods demanded a particular offering, it would be made. The rulers consulted them before making major decisions. But the priests were not the only source of authority. There were also the kings. The word king is a translation. The Sumerian terms were Ensi and Lugal. These roles evolved over time, and their exact meanings are debated. But by the early dynastic period, most cities were ruled by figures who combined religious and political authority. The king was chosen by the gods, or at least that was the claim. In practice, kingship often passed from father to son. But the legitimacy of the king depended on divine approval. He ruled because the gods willed it. And if he failed, if the harvests were poor, if the city was defeated in war, it might be taken as a sign that the gods had withdrawn their favor. The king had responsibilities. He was expected to maintain the irrigation systems, to build and repair temples, to lead the army in war, to administer justice, to ensure that the weak were protected from the strong. This last duty was taken seriously. There are records of kings boasting about their justice, about how they prevented the rich from oppressing the poor, about how they ensured fair weights and measures in the marketplace. Whether they actually did these things is another question. But the fact that they felt the need to claim it tells us something about what was valued. The king lived in a palace. This was a large complex of buildings with courtyards and storerooms and administrative offices. It was the center of secular power, just as the temple was the center of religious power. In some cities, these two centers worked together. In others, they competed. The palace employed many people: scribes to keep records, soldiers to enforce the king's will, servants to maintain the buildings and prepare food, craftspeople to make the goods the king needed. All of these people depended on the king for their livelihood, and the king depended on them to maintain his power. Warfare was a constant concern. The cities of Sumer were close together, and they competed for resources. Disputes over water rights could escalate into armed conflict. A strong king might try to dominate neighboring cities, forcing them to pay tribute. The armies were not professional. They were made up of citizens who were called to fight when needed, farmers and craftspeople who set aside their tools and took up weapons. They fought in formation with spears and shields. The goal was usually to break the enemy's line, to force them to flee. Battles were chaotic and brutal. There was no chivalry, no rules of engagement. The victors might kill the defeated, or they might enslave them. Cities that resisted might be burned. their walls torn down, their fields salted so nothing would grow. But total destruction was rare. More often, the defeated city would submit. It would acknowledge the supremacy of the victor's god. It would pay tribute, and life would continue under new management. The kings commemorated their victories with monuments, stone steles carved with images of the king trampling his enemies, inscriptions listing the cities conquered, the spoils taken, the glory won. These monuments were placed in temples, where they would be seen by the gods and by future generations. But the kings also built other things: canals, granaries, city walls. These were practical projects, but they were also statements of power. A king who could organize the labor to dig a major canal was demonstrating his authority. He was showing that he could command thousands of people, that he could reshape the landscape itself. The common people had little say in any of this. They paid taxes. They provided labor when it was demanded. They fought in wars they didn't start. They lived and died according to the decisions of people they would never meet. But they were not entirely powerless. They had their own communities, their own neighborhoods, their own networks of family and friends. They helped each other. They shared food in times of scarcity. They celebrated together. They mourned together. And they had their own relationship with the gods. They made small offerings at household shrines. They prayed for protection, for health, for good fortune. They didn't need priests to mediate every interaction with the divine. The gods, in Sumerian thought, had created humans for a specific purpose: to work, to serve the gods, to provide them with food and drink and worship. This might sound grim, but it wasn't necessarily experienced that way. Work was simply the nature of existence. Everyone worked. Even the gods worked in the myths. They had their own tasks and responsibilities. The creation myth told how the gods had grown tired of doing their own labor. So they created humans from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god. Humans were made to be workers, but they were also made in the image of the gods. They had intelligence. They had the ability to create. They were not just slaves. This myth explained the human condition, why life was hard, why work was necessary. But it also gave humans dignity. They were created by the gods. They had a purpose. They were part of the cosmic order. Death was inevitable, but it was not the end. The dead went to the underworld, to Kur. This was not a place of punishment or reward. It was simply where the dead existed. They were shadows of their former selves, eating dust, drinking muddy water. It was a bleak vision, but it was democratic. Everyone went there, rich and poor, king and commoner. The only way to avoid being forgotten was to leave something behind. Children who would remember you, a name carved in stone, a deed that would be spoken of. This is why the kings built monuments, why they recorded their achievements. They were trying to cheat death, not by avoiding it, but by ensuring they would be remembered. For ordinary people, the path to remembrance was simpler. You raised children. You taught them your name. You told them stories about their grandparents. You maintained the family, and when you died, they would speak your name and pour libations at your grave. This was the social order. The gods at the top, distant but powerful. The king, chosen by the gods, ruling in their name. The priests, interpreting the will of the gods. The nobles and wealthy merchants, controlling resources. And below them, the vast majority of people, working the fields, making the goods, building the cities. It was a hierarchy, but it was not rigid. A talented scribe could rise in status. A successful merchant could become wealthy. A brave soldier might be rewarded with land. There was some mobility, some possibility of change. But for most people, life was determined by birth. You were born into a family, a neighborhood, a social position, and you stayed there. You learned the trade of your father. You married someone from a similar background. You raised your children to do the same. This stability was valued. Change was often seen as dangerous. The old ways were the good ways. Innovation was suspect. The goal was not to transform society, but to maintain it, to keep the gods happy, to keep the rivers flowing, to keep the crops growing. And for long stretches of time, this worked. The cities prospered, the population grew, the irrigation systems expanded, trade networks reached farther. Goods from distant lands appeared in the markets. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia. The scribes kept records of all of this: contracts, receipts, letters, legal disputes, marriage agreements, adoption papers. The clay tablets piled up in archives, creating an accidental record of daily life. These tablets tell us about ordinary concerns. A man borrowing grain and promising to repay it after the harvest. A woman divorcing her husband and claiming her dowry. A merchant complaining about the quality of copper he received. A father adopting a son to ensure someone would care for him in old age. The tablets also preserve literature, hymns to the gods, proverbs, myths. The earliest known author was a woman named Enheduanna. She was a priestess, the daughter of King Sargon. She wrote hymns to Inanna, powerful poems that expressed both devotion and personal emotion. Her work survived because it was copied by later scribes. It was used in scribal schools as a teaching text. Students would practice their writing by copying her words, and in doing so, they preserved her voice across thousands of years. This is one of the miracles of writing. It allows the dead to speak. It preserves thoughts and feelings that would otherwise be lost. It creates a connection across time. But writing was still rare. Most people couldn't read. Most communication was oral. Stories were told, not written. Knowledge was passed down through demonstration and memory. Writing was a tool of the elite, used for administration and record-keeping. Still, its existence changed things. It made possible a level of complexity that couldn't exist without it. You could track debts over years. You could record laws that would apply to everyone. You could send messages to distant cities. You could preserve the words of the gods as spoken through the priests. The temples and palaces were full of these tablets, stacked in rooms, organized by category, a bureaucracy of clay. It was tedious work, but it was essential. It made the system function, and the system did function. For centuries, the cities of Sumer thrived. They competed with each other, but they also shared a common culture, the same gods, the same writing system, the same basic understanding of how the world worked. They believed in order, in hierarchy, in the importance of ritual and tradition. They believed the gods had established the way things should be, and that humans should maintain it. This worldview shaped everything: the architecture, the art, the literature, the law. It created a civilization that was stable, productive, and deeply religious. But it was also fragile. It depended on the rivers, on the irrigation systems, on the cooperation of thousands of people, on the favor of the gods. And eventually, that favor would seem to waver. The cities would face new challenges, new enemies, new forms of organization. But for now, in this moment, the system held. The ziggurats rose above the plain. The priests performed their rituals. The kings ruled in the name of the gods. The people worked and worshipped and slept. The night came, as it always did. The stars appeared. The fires burned in the temples. And somewhere, a scribe put down his stylus, smoothed the clay, and went home to rest. Tomorrow, the work would continue. The gods would be served. The order would be maintained. For now, that was enough. For centuries, the cities of Sumer had existed side by side. They competed. They fought. They made alliances and broke them. But they remained separate. Each city was its own world, with its own king, its own god, its own identity. No one had managed to unite them. No one had even tried, really. The idea of one ruler controlling multiple cities was foreign. Power was local. It belonged to the city and its patron deity. But around 4,300 years ago, something changed. A man named Sargon came to power in the city of Akkad. We don't know much about his early life. The stories say he was born in humble circumstances, that his mother was a priestess who couldn't keep him, that she placed him in a basket and set him adrift on the river, where he was found and raised by a gardener. This story is probably not true. It's too similar to other hero myths. But it tells us something about how Sargon wanted to be seen, as someone who rose from nothing, who was chosen by fate or by the gods for greatness. What we know for certain is that Sargon became cupbearer to the king of Kish. This was a position of trust, close to power, and somehow, through means that aren't recorded, Sargon took that power for himself. He founded a new city, Akkad. We've never found it. Archaeologists have searched, but the location remains unknown. It may be buried under later settlements, or it may have been completely destroyed. But in its time, it was the center of something new. Sargon didn't just rule Akkad. He conquered the other cities of Sumer. One by one, he defeated their armies. He tore down their walls. He installed his own governors. He took their wealth and brought it back to Akkad. This was unprecedented. The Sumerian cities had fought each other for generations, but no one had managed to dominate all of them. Sargon did, and he didn't stop there. He pushed north into the lands beyond Sumer. He conquered cities in what is now Syria. He reached the Mediterranean coast. He claimed to have washed his weapons in the sea, a symbolic gesture of reaching the edge of the known world. To the east, he pushed into the mountains of Elam. To the west, into the desert. His empire stretched farther than any political entity had before. It encompassed different peoples, different languages, different traditions. This required a new way of thinking about power. Sargon couldn't rule this vast territory the way a Sumerian king ruled a single city. He needed a different system. He appointed governors to rule in his name. He stationed garrisons in conquered cities. He built roads to allow his armies to move quickly. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. He created, in effect, the first empire. The language of this empire was Akkadian. This was a Semitic language, different from Sumerian. It had been spoken in the northern part of Mesopotamia for a long time, but it had never been written down. Sargon's scribes adapted the cuneiform writing system to represent Akkadian sounds. This was a significant shift. Sumerian had been the language of administration, of literature, of religion. Now Akkadian began to take its place. Sumerian didn't disappear. It remained the language of religious texts and scholarly writing for centuries. but Akkadian became the language of power. The Akkadian Empire was held together by force. Sargon's army was large and well organized. He could move troops quickly to suppress rebellions. He could punish cities that resisted. He made examples of those who defied him. But force alone wasn't enough. Sargon also used propaganda. He commissioned inscriptions that celebrated his victories. He claimed divine favor. He presented himself as the chosen of the gods, destined to rule. One inscription describes him as Sargon, king of Akkad, overseer of Inanna, king of Kish, anointed priest of Anu, king of the land, great Ensi of Enlil. These titles connected him to the major gods and to the traditional sources of authority in Sumer. He was claiming legitimacy, not just through conquest, but through divine approval. His daughter, Enheduanna, played a role in this. She was appointed high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. This was a political appointment as much as a religious one. It tied the conquered Sumerian cities to Sargon's dynasty through religious authority. Enheduanna wrote hymns that praised both the gods and her father. Her poetry was powerful and personal. It expressed genuine religious devotion, but it also served a political purpose. It legitimized Akkadian rule over Sumer. The empire brought changes. Trade expanded. Goods moved more freely across longer distances. The roads that Sargon built for his armies also served merchants. Caravans traveled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, carrying textiles, metals, precious stones. Akkad became wealthy. The tribute from conquered cities flowed into its treasuries. The palace and temples were filled with gold and silver. Craftspeople created elaborate works of art. Sculptors carved stone with unprecedented skill. But the empire also created resentment. The Sumerian cities had been independent for centuries. They had their own traditions, their own pride. Being ruled by an outsider, by someone who spoke a different language, was humiliating. Rebellions broke out. Cities tried to break free. Sargon spent much of his reign putting down these revolts. He was successful, but it required constant vigilance. The empire was always on the edge of fracturing. Sargon ruled for over 50 years. When he died, his son Rimush took power, then his other son Manishtushu, then his grandson Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin was perhaps the most powerful of the Akkadian kings. He expanded the empire even further. He defeated coalitions of cities that tried to resist him. He claimed divine status, calling himself God of Akkad. This was extraordinary. Kings had always claimed to rule, with divine approval. But Naram-Sin claimed to be a god himself. He commissioned a famous stele showing himself trampling his enemies. He's depicted larger than the other figures, wearing a horned crown, a symbol of divinity. He stands on a mountain with stars above him. The message is clear. He is above ordinary humans. He is chosen by the gods, or perhaps he is a god himself. This claim was controversial. It suggested a level of arrogance that made people uncomfortable. And when things went wrong, it would be seen as evidence of divine displeasure. The empire began to face new challenges. Climate change may have played a role. There's evidence of a prolonged drought around this time. The harvests failed. Famine spread. People began to move, seeking better conditions. From the north and east came new groups. The Gutians, mountain people who had previously been on the margins of Mesopotamian civilization. They raided the settled lands. They disrupted trade routes. They couldn't be easily defeated because they didn't have cities to conquer. They were mobile, elusive. The empire's resources were stretched. Maintaining control over such a vast territory required constant military action. The costs were enormous. The tribute from conquered cities wasn't enough to cover the expenses. Internal problems grew. Governors in distant provinces began to act independently. They stopped sending tribute. They made their own alliances. The center couldn't control the periphery anymore. Naram-Sin's son, Sharkali-Shari, inherited an empire in crisis. He fought to hold it together, but he was only partially successful. After his death, the empire collapsed. The collapse was swift. Within a generation, the Akkadian Empire ceased to exist. The cities of Sumer regained their independence. Akkad itself faded from history. The great capital that Sargon had built was abandoned or destroyed. Its location was forgotten. The Gutians filled the power vacuum. They controlled parts of Mesopotamia for several decades. But they never created a unified state. They were raiders, not administrators. They took what they could and moved on. This period is often described as a dark age. The written records become sparse. Building projects stopped. Trade declined. It seems like a time of chaos and decline. But life continued. The cities still existed. People still farmed. They still made pottery and wove cloth. The irrigation systems still functioned, though they may have been less well-maintained. And the memory of the Akkadian Empire persisted. Later, generations would look back on it as a golden age. Sargon became a legendary figure. Stories were told about him for thousands of years. He was remembered as the great conqueror, the king who united the world. The empire had lasted less than 2 centuries, but it had changed Mesopotamia permanently. It had shown that large-scale political organization was possible. It had created new trade networks. It had spread Akkadian language and culture across a wide area. And it had established a model. Future rulers would try to recreate what Sargon had built. They would claim to be his successors. They would use his titles. They would invoke his name. The idea of empire had been born. The idea that one ruler could control many cities, many peoples, that power could be centralized, that the world could be unified under a single authority. This idea would never completely disappear. Even when empires fell, even when the land fragmented into competing kingdoms, the memory remained. The possibility remained. For now, though, the empire was gone. The cities were independent again. The Gutians raided and withdrew. And in the south, in the old Sumerian heartland, people began to rebuild. They cleared the canals. They repaired the temples. They reestablished the old ways. The gods were still there. The rivers still flowed. The soil was still fertile. Life had been disrupted, but it hadn't ended. The people endured. They adapted. They survived. The night came, as it always did. The stars appeared, the same stars that had shone on Sargon's armies, on the cities he conquered, on the empire he built. Those armies were gone now. The empire was gone. But the stars remained, and the people remained, and the slow work of living continued. In the darkness, in the small houses of mud, brick, families gathered. They ate their simple meals. They told stories. They slept. And in the morning they would wake and begin again. Because that's what people do. They endure, they continue, they build, even knowing that what they build might not last. The rivers kept flowing. The seasons kept turning. And somewhere in the ruins of empire, new possibilities were taking shape. The Gutians didn't build cities. They came from the Zagros Mountains, from the high country to the east. They were herders and raiders. moving with the seasons, following their flocks. They had no interest in administration or irrigation systems or temple complexes. They wanted plunder, tribute, control over trade routes, and for a time they had it. The Mesopotamian cities paid them to go away, or they paid them to stay away from rival cities, or they simply endured the raids and rebuilt afterward. It was a chaotic time. Power was fragmented. No single authority controlled the region. The written records from this period are sparse. The scribes had less to record, or perhaps their tablets were lost, or perhaps the institutions that employed scribes, the temples and palaces, had fewer resources to support them. But the cities survived. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur. They were damaged, diminished, but not destroyed. The walls still stood. The temples still functioned. The people still farmed the land. And, gradually, some cities began to recover, to reassert themselves, to push back against the Gutians and against each other. One of these cities was Lagash. Under a ruler named Gudea, it experienced a renaissance. Gudea wasn't a great conqueror. He didn't build an empire. But he was a builder in a different sense. He rebuilt temples. He commissioned statues. He wrote hymns. He presented himself as a pious ruler, devoted to the gods, concerned with justice and proper ritual. His statues show him in a posture of prayer, hands clasped, eyes downcast, humble before the divine. These statues were made of diorite, a hard black stone imported from distant lands. They were carved with extraordinary skill. The details of his face, his hands, the folds of his garment, all rendered with precision. These were expensive objects, statements of wealth and piety. The inscriptions on the statues describe Gudea's building projects, how he brought cedar from Lebanon, how he imported gold and precious stones, how he rebuilt the temple of Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash, how he ensured that the rituals were performed correctly. This focus on religion and building suggests a different kind of power. Not military conquest, but cultural and economic strength. Lagash was prosperous. It had trade connections. It could afford to import luxury goods and employ skilled craftspeople. But Lagash was just one city. It didn't control its neighbors. It existed in a landscape of competing powers, each trying to maintain its independence and expand its influence when possible. Then, around 4,100 years ago, a new power emerged. The city of Ur. Ur had been important before. It was one of the oldest Sumerian cities, but now, under a new dynasty, it became dominant. The kings of this period are called the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-Thur. The founder was Ur-Nammu. He defeated the Gutians. He conquered the other Sumerian cities. He reunified the region under a single authority. In some ways, he was recreating what Sargon had done, but he did it differently. Ur-Nammu presented himself as a Sumerian king, not a foreign conqueror. He used Sumerian titles. He honored the traditional gods. He claimed to be restoring the old order, not creating something new. He's most famous for his law code. This is one of the earliest known collections of laws written in Sumerian. It's fragmentary. We don't have the complete text. But what survives shows a concern with justice and social order. The laws cover various situations: disputes over property, injuries caused by negligence, marriage and divorce, slavery. The penalties are often fines rather than physical punishment. If you injure someone, you pay compensation. If you damage someone's property, you replace it. This suggests a society that valued order and predictability. where disputes could be resolved through established procedures rather than violence. Where the king's role was to ensure fairness. Ur-Nammu also built. He rebuilt the ziggurat at Ur, creating one of the most impressive structures in Mesopotamia. It still stands today, or at least its base does. A massive stepped pyramid of mud brick rising above the desert. His son, Shulgi, continued these policies. Shulgi ruled for nearly 50 years. He expanded the empire. He reorganized the administration. He created a highly centralized bureaucratic state. The Ur-Threat period is remarkable for its record-keeping. Thousands of clay tablets survive from this time. They document everything. Deliveries of grain, assignments of workers, rations distributed, animals counted, land surveyed. This was a managed economy. The state controlled production and distribution. Workers were organized into teams and assigned tasks. They received rations in return for their labor. Everything was recorded, tracked, accounted for. It was efficient in its way. But it was also rigid. There was little room for individual initiative. You did the work you were assigned. You received the rations you were allotted. The system ran like a machine, with humans as its components. The tablets give us an incredibly detailed picture of daily life. We know what workers ate, how much they were given, what tools they used, how long different tasks took. We can reconstruct the economy with precision, but we lose something too. The individual voices, the personal stories. The tablets are bureaucratic documents. They record facts, not feelings. We see the system, but we don't see the people within it. Still, we can infer some things. The workers were not slaves exactly. They were free people who owed labor to the state. But their freedom was limited. They couldn't leave. They couldn't choose their work. They were bound to the system. Women worked alongside men. They wove cloth. They ground grain. They worked in the fields during harvest. They received smaller rations than men, which tells us something about how they were valued. But they were part of the workforce. They contributed to the economy. Children worked too, once they were old enough. Light tasks at first, carrying water, watching animals, helping with the harvest. By their early teens, they were doing adult work. The state provided for those who couldn't work, the elderly, the disabled. They received reduced rations, but they received something. The system had a basic safety net. This was the ideal anyway. Whether it always worked in practice is another question. Bureaucracies have a way of failing the people they're supposed to serve. Records can be falsified. Rations can be skimmed. Officials can be corrupt. But the system persisted for over a century. That suggests it was at least functional. People accepted it, or at least didn't rebel against it. Shulgi presented himself as a model king. He claimed to be a great warrior, a wise administrator, a pious servant of the gods. He wrote hymns in his own praise. He described himself as a runner who could cover vast distances in a single day, as a scholar who knew multiple languages, as a musician who could play many instruments. Some of this was probably exaggeration, but it tells us what qualities were valued in a king: strength, intelligence, piety, versatility. Shulgi also claimed divine status, like Naram-Sin before him. He was worshipped as a god in some cities. Temples were dedicated to him. Offerings were made in his name. This deification of kings was controversial. It went against the traditional understanding that humans and gods were separate. But it served a political purpose. A divine king had absolute authority. To disobey him was to disobey the gods. The empire reached its height under Shulgi. It controlled all of southern Mesopotamia and extended into the surrounding regions. Trade flourished. The cities were prosperous. The temples were rebuilt and expanded. But the system had weaknesses. It was too centralized, too dependent on the king's personal authority, too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances. And circumstances were changing. The climate was shifting again. Rainfall patterns were becoming less reliable. The harvests were more variable. The irrigation systems required constant maintenance, and any disruption could be catastrophic. From the east came new pressures. Groups of people moving into Mesopotamia, seeking land and resources. The Amorites, Semitic-speaking nomads from the western desert. The Elamites from the mountains to the east. The empire tried to keep them out. It built walls. It stationed troops on the borders. But walls can be bypassed. Troops can be defeated. And the pressure kept building. Shulgi's successors tried to maintain the system, but they faced increasing difficulties. Rebellions in outlying provinces, raids from nomadic groups, economic strain from maintaining the bureaucracy and the military. The last king of Ur III was Ibbi-Sin. He ruled for about 25 years, but his control was slipping. Provinces broke away. Governors declared independence. The Elamites invaded from the east. Finally, around 4,000 years ago, the Elamites captured Ur itself. They sacked the city. They took Ibbi-Sin prisoner. The dynasty ended. There's a lament written about this event. The Lament for Ur. It's a long poem describing the destruction of the city. The temples burned. The people killed or enslaved. The gods abandoning their shrines. The poem is heartbreaking. It describes mothers searching for their children, old people dying in the streets, the city that had been the center of the world reduced to ruins. But it's also stylized. It follows conventions. It's not a historical account exactly. It's a ritual text meant to be recited, a way of processing grief and loss. And the destruction wasn't total. Ur survived. It was damaged, but it wasn't abandoned. People rebuilt. Life continued. The Ur-Thr state was gone, but the cities remained. The irrigation systems remained. The fields remained, and the people remained, doing what they had always done, planting, harvesting, raising children, burying the dead. The political unity was lost. The region fragmented again into competing city-states. But the culture persisted. The language, the writing system, the gods, the stories. This pattern would repeat throughout Mesopotamian history. Empires would rise and fall. Cities would be conquered and liberated. Dynasties would come and go. But the underlying civilization endured. Because it wasn't based on any single political structure. It was based on the land, on the rivers, on the knowledge of how to work the soil and manage the water, on the shared culture and religion. These things couldn't be destroyed by military defeat. They could only be eroded slowly over centuries by larger forces, climate change, population movement, the rise of new centers of power in other regions. But that erosion was still far in the future. For now, in the aftermath of Ur's fall, the cities picked themselves up and continued. New powers emerged, new dynasties, new attempts to unify the region. The cycle continued. The night came, as it always did. The stars appeared. The rivers flowed. And in the small houses, in the rebuilt neighborhoods, people slept. They had survived the fall of empires before. They would survive it again, because survival was what they did. It was what their ancestors had done. It was what their children would do. the land remained. The knowledge remained. The will to continue remained. And that, in the end, was enough. After Ur fell, the land fractured. City-states competed for dominance. Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna. Each claimed to be the rightful heir to the old Sumerian kingdoms. Each tried to control the irrigation systems and the trade routes. Each fought the others for supremacy, but none succeeded in unifying the region, not for a long time. Meanwhile, new people were arriving. The Amorites, who had been pressing at the borders for generations, now moved into Mesopotamia in larger numbers. They settled in the cities. They adopted the local culture. They learned cuneiform. They worshipped the Mesopotamian gods. But they also brought their own traditions, their own language, which was Semitic, related to Akkadian, their own social structures. Over time, these blended with the existing culture, creating something new. One of the cities where Amorites settled was Babylon. Babylon had existed for centuries, but it had never been particularly important. It was a modest city on the Euphrates, in the northern part of the old Sumerian heartland. It had no great temple, no famous ziggurat, no history of powerful kings, but its location was good. It sat at a crossroads of trade routes. It had access to water, and under Amorite leadership it began to grow. The dynasty that would make Babylon great was founded by a man named Sumu Abum. He and his successors gradually expanded their control over the surrounding territory. They conquered nearby cities. They built alliances. They waited for opportunities. The opportunity came with a king named Hammurabi. Hammurabi came to power around 3,800 years ago. At first, he seemed like just another city-state ruler. He made alliances. He fought small wars. He administered his territory. Nothing remarkable. But he was patient. He watched. He waited. And when the time was right, he struck. He defeated Larsa, the dominant power in the south. He conquered Eshnunna to the north. He pushed into Assyria. He brought Mari, a powerful city on the Euphrates, under his control. Within a few years, he had unified most of Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule. This was the first time since the Ur-3 period that the region had been united, and Hammurabi did it not just through military conquest, but through diplomacy and careful timing. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate, when to make alliances and when to break them. But Hammurabi is most famous for something else, his law code. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most well-known documents from the ancient world. It's a collection of laws and legal decisions, carved on a large stone stele. The stele shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. The code contains nearly 300 laws. They cover a wide range of situations: property disputes, theft, assault, murder, marriage and divorce, inheritance, business transactions, medical malpractice, building codes. The laws are specific. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder is put to death. If a surgeon performs an operation and the patient dies, the surgeon's hand is cut off. If someone steals an ox, they must pay back 30 times its value. The punishments vary depending on social status. If a nobleman injures another nobleman, the penalty is severe. If a nobleman injures a commoner, the penalty is less. If a slave is injured, the penalty is even less. This reflects the hierarchical nature of Babylonian society. People were not equal before the law. Justice was stratified, just like everything else. But the code also shows a concern with fairness within those hierarchies. The strong shouldn't oppress the weak. Widows and orphans should be protected. Merchants shouldn't cheat their customers. Landlords shouldn't exploit their tenants. Whether these laws were actually enforced is debatable. The code may have been more aspirational than practical, a statement of ideals rather than a description of reality. But it was influential. It was copied and studied for centuries. It became a model for later law codes, and it tells us something about how the Babylonians thought about justice and social order. Hammurabi also built. He repaired canals. He rebuilt temples. He fortified cities. He created an administrative system to manage his empire. He appointed governors. He sent out inspectors to ensure his orders were being followed. He corresponded with these officials. Many of his letters survive on clay tablets. They deal with mundane matters, disputes over water rights, reports of banditry, requests for supplies, instructions for building projects. The letters show Hammurabi as a hands-on ruler. He paid attention to details. He wanted to know what was happening in every part of his empire. He made decisions about small matters as well as large ones. This level of control required a large bureaucracy. Scribes, messengers, officials, all of them dependent on the king for their positions. All of them part of a system that centered on Babylon. The city itself grew wealthy. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories. Trade goods passed through its markets. Craftspeople produced luxury items for the palace and the temples. The streets of Babylon were crowded. Merchants called out their wares. Donkeys carried loads of grain and oil. Children played in the alleys. Women drew water from wells. Men sat in the shade, drinking beer and talking. The houses were still made of mud brick. Most people still lived in small, simple dwellings. But the wealthy had larger homes, multiple rooms around a courtyard, decorated walls, fine furniture, servants to do the work. At night, the city grew quieter. Oil lamps flickered in windows. Fires burned in courtyards. People ate their evening meals, barley bread, onions, dates, fish from the river. Beer, always beer. They told stories about the gods, about heroes, about the old days. The stories were passed down, generation to generation. Some were written down by scribes. Others remained oral, changing slightly with each telling. One of the most famous stories from this period is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's about a king of Uruk who goes on a quest for immortality. He has adventures. He fights monsters. He loses his friend. He searches for the secret of eternal life. In the end, he fails. He learns that immortality is reserved for the gods. Humans must accept their mortality. They must find meaning in the life they have, not in the life they wish they could have. The epic is profound. It deals with friendship, loss, the fear of death, the search for meaning. It's one of the earliest works of literature, and it still resonates today. But for the people of Babylon, it was just one story among many. They had stories about the creation of the world, about the flood that destroyed humanity, about the gods and their conflicts, about heroes and monsters and magic. These stories shaped how they understood the world. They explained why things were the way they were, why humans had to work, why they suffered, why they died. The gods in these stories were powerful but not omnipotent. They made mistakes. They argued. They changed their minds. They were, in many ways, like humans but magnified. This made them relatable. You could understand why a god might be angry or pleased. You could try to influence them through offerings and prayers. You could negotiate with them, in a sense. The temples were the places where this negotiation happened. The priests performed the rituals. They made the offerings. They interpreted the omens. They mediated between the human and divine worlds. The main temple in Babylon was dedicated to Marduk, the city's patron god. Marduk had not always been important. He was a relatively minor deity in the old Sumerian pantheon. But as Babylon rose to power, so did Marduk. A new creation myth was written, placing Marduk at the center. In this myth, the gods are threatened by chaos, personified as the goddess Tiamat. They need a champion to fight her. Marduk volunteers, but he demands a price. If he defeats Tiamat, he must be made king of the gods. The gods agree. Marduk defeats Tiamat. He splits her body in half and uses it to create the heavens and the earth. He becomes the supreme god. And Babylon, his city, becomes the center of the world. This myth served a political purpose. It justified Babylon's dominance. If Marduk was king of the gods, then Babylon should be the capital of the empire. The myth made political power seem divinely ordained. But it was also a genuine religious text. People believed it. They recited it during festivals. They saw it as explaining the fundamental structure of reality. The New Year festival was the most important celebration in Babylon. It lasted for several days. The king played a central role. He would go to the temple and ritually humble himself before Marduk. The high priest would strike him on the cheek. The king would declare that he had not sinned, that he had ruled justly. This ritual renewal of kingship was crucial. It reaffirmed the king's legitimacy. It connected him to the gods. It reassured the people that the cosmic order was intact. After the ritual, there were processions. The statue of Marduk was carried through the streets. People lined the route, watching, celebrating. There was music, dancing, feasting, a temporary suspension of normal life. These festivals were important for social cohesion. They brought the community together. They reinforced shared beliefs and values. They provided a break from the routine of work. But most days were not festival days. Most days were ordinary. People woke at dawn. They worked. They ate simple meals. They dealt with the small problems of daily life. Disputes arose. Someone's goat ate someone else's grain. A merchant claimed he was cheated. A wife wanted a divorce. These matters were brought before judges who would hear both sides and make a decision based on the law and on precedent. The legal system was well developed. There were courts. There were procedures. There were records kept of decisions, which could be referenced in future cases. This created a sense of predictability. You knew, more or less, what would happen if you broke the law or if someone wronged you. Children grew up learning the ways of their parents. Boys learned their father's trade. Girls learned to manage a household. There was some education for the elite. Scribal schools where boys learned to read and write. But for most people, education was informal. You learned by doing. Marriage was arranged by families. It was an economic transaction as much as a personal one. The groom's family paid a bride price. The bride's family provided a dowry. Contracts were drawn up, specifying the terms. But this doesn't mean there was no affection. Letters survive that show genuine emotion between spouses. Concern when one was away. Grief when one died. The system was practical, but people were still people. They loved. They cared. They mourned. Death was inevitable. When someone died, they were buried with care. The body was wrapped. Grave goods were provided. Food and drink for the journey to the underworld. The family would mourn. They would make offerings at the grave. The underworld was still imagined as a dark, dusty place. Not a place of punishment, but not pleasant either. Just a dim continuation of existence. The dead were shadows, eating dust, drinking muddy water. This belief shaped how people lived. There was no promise of reward in the afterlife. So you focused on this life, on building something that would last, on being remembered, on leaving children who would speak your name. Hammurabi ruled for over 40 years. When he died, his son Samsu-iluna inherited the empire. But the empire was already beginning to fracture. The southern cities rebelled. New groups pressed at the borders. The Kassites from the east, the Hittites from the north. Samsu-iluna managed to hold things together, but barely. His successors faced increasing difficulties. The empire shrank. Babylon's control weakened. Eventually, around 3,600 years ago, the Hittites raided Babylon itself. They sacked the city. They took the statue of Marduk. This was a devastating blow. Without the god's presence, how could the city prosper? The first dynasty of Babylon ended. The city fell under the control of the Kassites, who would rule for centuries. But that's another chapter. For now, we're left with the memory of Hammurabi's Babylon, the city that unified Mesopotamia, the city of laws and temples and bustling markets, the city where Marduk was king of the gods and Babylon was the center of the world. It was a brief moment of unity, but it left a lasting impression. Babylon would rise again, and again. It would become one of the most famous cities in history, a symbol of power and wealth and culture, but also of pride, of ambition, of the human desire to build something that will last forever. The night came. The stars appeared. The Euphrates flowed past the city walls, and in the houses, in the streets, in the temple courtyards, people slept. They didn't know that their city would be remembered for thousands of years. They were just living their lives, working, loving, hoping, fearing, trying to make sense of a world that was vast and uncertain, trying to find meaning in the brief span of years they were given. The rivers kept flowing. The seasons kept turning. And the people kept going, one day at a time. For now, that was enough. While Babylon rose and fell in the south, another power was growing in the north. Assyria. The land of Assyria was different from Sumer or Babylon. It was hillier, rockier. The rivers were faster, harder to control. There was more rainfall, which meant less dependence on irrigation. But it also meant the land was less fertile. The Assyrians had to work harder for what they got, and perhaps that shaped them, made them tougher, more aggressive, more willing to take what they needed from others. The city of Ashur was the heart of Assyria. It sat on the Tigris at a strategic point for trade. Merchants from Ashur traveled far, establishing trading colonies in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. They traded textiles and tin for silver and gold. This trade made Ashur wealthy, but it also made it vulnerable. The trade routes had to be protected. Competitors had to be kept at bay, and gradually the need for security pushed Assyria toward militarism. The early Assyrian kings were modest figures. They ruled a small territory. They paid tribute to more powerful neighbors. They survived by being careful, by not attracting too much attention. But over time, Assyria grew stronger. The kings expanded their territory. They conquered neighboring cities. They built an army that became the most feared force in the ancient world. This didn't happen all at once. There were periods of expansion and periods of decline. The Old Assyrian period, the Middle Assyrian period. times when Assyria dominated the region and times when it barely survived. But by around 3,000 years ago, Assyria entered its final and greatest phase, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Assyrian kings were conquerors. They campaigned every year, pushing the borders of their empire farther and farther. They conquered Syria. They conquered Babylon. They pushed into Egypt. They reached the Mediterranean coast and the Persian Gulf. At its height, the Assyrian Empire was the largest the world had yet seen. It stretched from the mountains of Iran to the deserts of Egypt. It encompassed dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures. Holding this empire together required constant military action. The army was always on campaign, always fighting, always suppressing rebellions and conquering new territories. The Assyrian army was highly organized. It had infantry, cavalry, chariots, siege engines, engineers who could build ramps and towers to assault city walls, archers who could rain arrows on enemy formations. The soldiers were professionals, not farmers called up for a season, but men who made war their career. They were well equipped. They wore armor. They carried iron weapons, which were stronger than the bronze weapons of earlier periods. And they were brutal. The Assyrians used terror as a weapon. When a city resisted, the consequences were severe. The walls were torn down, the buildings were burned. The population was killed or enslaved. The survivors were impaled on stakes outside the ruins as a warning to others. The Assyrian kings boasted about this in their inscriptions. They described in detail the suffering they inflicted, the cities they destroyed, the people they killed, the pyramids of severed heads they built. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake, it was policy. The goal was to make resistance seem futile, to convince cities to surrender without a fight, to create a reputation so fearsome that enemies would submit rather than face destruction. And it worked. Many cities did surrender. They paid tribute. They acknowledged Assyrian supremacy. They sent their sons as hostages to ensure their loyalty. But the policy also created resentment. The conquered peoples hated Assyria. They waited for any sign of weakness. They rebelled whenever they thought they had a chance. So the army had to keep campaigning, keep suppressing rebellions, keep demonstrating that resistance was impossible. This required enormous resources. The empire had to support a large standing army. It had to maintain roads and supply lines. It had to administer conquered territories. The Assyrians developed sophisticated administrative systems. They divided the empire into provinces, each governed by an appointed official. They conducted censuses to track population and resources. They collected taxes in the form of grain, livestock, and precious metals. They also deported populations. When a region rebelled, the Assyrians would forcibly move its people to another part of the empire. This broke up local identities and resistance networks. It made future rebellions less likely. But it also created a diverse, multicultural empire. In Assyrian cities, you might hear a dozen different languages. See people from Egypt, from Anatolia, from Iran, all living side by side. The capital moved several times. Ashur remained important as a religious center, but the administrative capital shifted. First to Kalhu, then to Dur-Sharrukin, then to Nineveh. Nineveh became the greatest of the Assyrian cities. It was massive, with walls that stretched for miles. Inside were palaces, temples, gardens, libraries. It was a showcase of Assyrian power and wealth. The palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh was particularly impressive. It had dozens of rooms decorated with carved stone reliefs. These reliefs showed the king's victories, his armies besieging cities, his enemies fleeing or submitting, his triumphal processions. But they also showed daily life, workers building the palace, servants bringing food, musicians playing instruments, scribes recording events. These images give us a detailed picture of Assyrian society. The palace also had gardens. Sennacherib was proud of these. He had water brought from distant mountains through a system of canals and aqueducts. He planted trees and plants from across the empire. He created an artificial paradise in the middle of the city. Some scholars think these might be the famous Hanging Gardens, traditionally attributed to Babylon. The evidence is debatable, but it shows that the Assyrians valued beauty as well as power. Another Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, created something even more remarkable: a library. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained thousands of clay tablets, texts on every subject: literature, science, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, history, religion, magic. Ashurbanipal sent scribes throughout the empire to copy texts. He wanted to gather all knowledge in one place, to preserve it, to make it accessible. This was an extraordinary vision, a recognition that knowledge had value, that it was worth preserving, that future generations might want to learn from the past. Many of the texts we have from ancient Mesopotamia come from this library: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, medical texts, astronomical observations, all preserved because Ashurbanipal decided they were important. He was a literate king, which was unusual. Most kings couldn't read or write. They relied on scribes. But Ashurbanipal had been educated. He could read Sumerian and Akkadian. He took a pride in his learning, but he was also a warrior. He campaigned in Egypt. He defeated Elam, Assyria's old enemy to the east. He suppressed rebellions in Babylon. He was as brutal as any of his predecessors. This combination, scholar and warrior, tells us something about Assyrian culture. They valued both strength and knowledge. They saw no contradiction between the two. The Assyrians worshipped the same gods as the Babylonians, more or less. Ashur, the patron god of Assyria, was identified with Enlil or sometimes with Marduk. Ishtar, the Assyrian version of Inanna, was the goddess of war and love. Shamash was the sun god and god of justice. But the emphasis was different. The Assyrian gods were more martial, more focused on conquest and victory. The king was their representative on earth, carrying out their will by expanding the empire. Religious rituals were important. The king participated in festivals. He made offerings. He consulted omens before campaigns. But religion served the state. It justified conquest. It legitimized power. The common people had their own religious practices. They made offerings at household shrines. They wore amulets for protection. They consulted diviners and exorcists when they were sick or troubled. Magic was taken seriously. There were spells for every purpose: to cure illness, to protect against demons, to ensure a good harvest, to win someone's love. These spells were written down, collected, studied. The Assyrians believed the world was full of invisible forces, demons that caused disease, spirits that haunted abandoned places, ghosts of the dead who hadn't been properly buried. You had to protect yourself against these threats. Daily life in Assyrian cities was similar to life in Babylon. People lived in mud brick houses. They worked as farmers, craftspeople, merchants. They ate barley bread and onions and dates. They drank beer. But there were differences. The Assyrian cities were more militarized. There were more soldiers, more weapons, more emphasis on martial values. Boys were trained to fight. They learned to use bows and spears. They practiced wrestling and running. Physical strength was valued. Weakness was despised. Women had less freedom than in earlier periods. They were expected to stay in the home, to manage the household, to raise children. In public, they were supposed to be veiled, but there were exceptions. Royal women could be powerful. Queen mothers advised their sons. Princesses were married to foreign rulers to seal alliances. Some women owned property and conducted business. Slavery was common. Prisoners of war were enslaved. People who couldn't pay their debts became slaves. Children could be sold into slavery by desperate parents. Slaves did the hard labor. They worked in the fields. They built the palaces and temples. They served in wealthy households. Their lives were hard, but they had some legal protections. They couldn't be killed arbitrarily. They could sometimes buy their freedom. The empire was wealthy. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories. Trade goods passed through Assyrian markets. The palaces and temples were filled with gold and silver and precious stones. But the wealth was unevenly distributed. The king and the nobility lived in luxury. The common people lived simply. The gap between rich and poor was vast, and the empire was always on edge, always fighting, always suppressing rebellions. The army was constantly on campaign. The resources were constantly strained. At night, in the great cities, the streets were patrolled by soldiers. The walls were guarded. The gates were locked. There was a sense of vigilance, of threat. But there was also a sense of pride, of being part of something powerful, of belonging to an empire that dominated the known world. In the palace, the king sat on his throne. He received reports from his governors. He planned campaigns. He made decisions that affected millions of people. In the library, scribes copied texts. They preserved knowledge. They created a record that would outlast the empire itself. In the temples, priests performed rituals. They made offerings. They prayed for victory and prosperity. And in the small houses, in the narrow streets, ordinary people lived their lives. They worked. They raised children. They told stories. They slept. They didn't know that the empire was fragile, that it depended on constant military success, that any major defeat could trigger a cascade of rebellions. They didn't know that within a few generations the empire would collapse, that Nineveh would be destroyed, that Assyria would disappear from history. They just lived, day by day, doing what they had always done, what their parents had done, what they expected their children to do. The stars turned overhead. The Tigris flowed past the city walls, and in the darkness the empire seemed eternal. But nothing is eternal, not even empires built on iron and terror. The night was long, but morning would come, and with it, change. While Assyria dominated the north, Babylon endured in the south. It had been conquered, occupied, ruled by foreigners. The Kassites had controlled it for centuries after Hammurabi's dynasty fell. Then came others, Elamites, Assyrians. The city changed hands many times. But Babylon never disappeared. It remained important, a center of culture and learning, a city with a long memory and a sense of its own significance. The Assyrians treated Babylon with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They recognized its cultural importance. Many Assyrian kings claimed to be protectors of Babylon's temples. They made offerings to Marduk, They participated in the New Year festival, but they also feared Babylon's independence. The city rebelled repeatedly, and each time the Assyrians had to reconquer it. One Assyrian king, Sennacherib, grew so frustrated with Babylonian rebellions that he destroyed the city. He tore down the walls. He burned the temples. He diverted the Euphrates to flood the ruins. He tried to erase Babylon from existence, but even this didn't work. His son, Esarhaddon, rebuilt the city. He restored the temples. He brought back the statue of Marduk. He tried to undo his father's destruction. This tells us something about Babylon's importance. Even the most powerful empire in the world couldn't afford to leave it destroyed. The city had symbolic weight, cultural authority, religious significance, and when the Assyrian Empire began to weaken, Babylon saw its opportunity. The collapse of Assyria was swift. After centuries of dominance, the empire fell apart in less than 20 years. The reasons were complex. The constant warfare had exhausted the empire's resources. The subject peoples were restless. The army was overstretched, and new enemies appeared. The Medes from the mountains of Iran grew powerful. They allied with the Babylonians. Together they attacked Assyria. The Assyrian cities fell one by one. Ashur, Kalhu, Nineveh, the great capital, was besieged and destroyed. The palaces were burned. The libraries were buried under rubble. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed invincible, ceased to exist, and from its ashes, a new Babylonian empire emerged. The founder of this Neo-Babylonian empire was Nabopolassar. He had been a governor under Assyrian rule. But when the empire weakened, he declared independence. He allied with the Medes. He led the armies that destroyed Nineveh. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, continued his work. Nebuchadnezzar became one of the most famous kings in history. He ruled for over 40 years. He expanded the empire. He rebuilt Babylon on a scale never seen before. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon became the greatest city in the world. The walls were massive. According to ancient sources, they were so wide that chariots could race on top of them. The city had multiple defensive walls, one inside the other. Gates decorated with glazed bricks showing dragons and bulls. The Ishtar Gate was particularly magnificent. It was covered in brilliant blue tiles. Images of animals marched across its surface in yellow and white. Lions, bulls, dragons. The gate led to a processional way that ran through the heart of the city. This processional way was used during the New Year festival. The statue of Marduk would be carried along it from the temple to a shrine outside the city and back again. The entire population would line the route, watching, celebrating. The temple of Marduk, called Esagila, was rebuilt and expanded. Next to it stood the great ziggurat, Etemenanki. This was the largest ziggurat ever built. It rose in 7 stages, each painted a different color. At the top was a shrine where Marduk was believed to descend from heaven. This ziggurat may be the origin of the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. A massive structure reaching toward the sky, a symbol of human ambition and divine power. Nebuchadnezzar also built palaces. The southern palace was enormous, with hundreds of rooms, throne rooms, audience halls, private apartments, storerooms, administrative offices, and then there were the gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Ancient writers described them in detail: terraced gardens rising high above the city, trees and plants from across the empire, water brought up from the Euphrates by some kind of mechanical system. The problem is we have no archaeological evidence for them. No Babylonian texts mention them. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, which describe his building projects in great detail, don't mention any gardens. Some scholars think the gardens never existed, that they were a legend or a confusion with the gardens at Nineveh. Others think they existed but were located elsewhere, or that the evidence was destroyed or hasn't been found yet. The truth is, we don't know. The gardens may have existed, or they may be a beautiful myth. Either way, they tell us something about how Babylon was perceived, as a place of wonder, of luxury, of impossible achievements. Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror as well as a builder. He campaigned in Syria and Palestine. He besieged Jerusalem. When the city rebelled, he destroyed it. He burned the temple. He took the population into exile in Babylon. This Babylonian exile is a crucial event in Jewish history. It's described in the Bible. The people of Judah, torn from their homeland, forced to live in a foreign city, mourning for Jerusalem, praying for return. But from the Babylonian perspective, this was just standard imperial policy. Rebellious cities were punished. Populations were deported. It had been done for centuries. The exiles lived in Babylon for several generations. Some prospered. They became merchants, craftspeople, officials. They learned Akkadian. They adapted to Babylonian life. But they also maintained their identity. They told their stories. They preserved their traditions. They remembered Jerusalem. Eventually, they would return. But that's part of the next chapter. For now, Babylon was at its height. The city was wealthy. The empire was powerful. The temples were magnificent. The festivals were grand. But there were problems beneath the surface. The empire was smaller than Assyria had been. It controlled Mesopotamia and Syria, but not Egypt or Anatolia or Iran. It faced powerful neighbors, the Medes to the east, the Lydians to the west, the Egyptians to the south, and the empire was expensive to maintain. The building projects required enormous resources. The army had to be paid. The bureaucracy had to be supported. Nebuchadnezzar managed it through force of will and careful administration. But his successors were less capable. After Nebuchadnezzar died, the empire went through a period of instability. Kings came and went. There were palace coups, assassinations, uncertainty. Finally, a man named Nabonidus came to power. He was an unusual king. He was deeply religious, but his religion was unconventional. He favored the moon god Sin over Marduk. He spent years away from Babylon, living in an oasis in Arabia. This alienated the priests of Marduk. It disrupted the religious festivals. It created resentment among the Babylonian elite. And it left the empire vulnerable. To the east, a new power was rising. Persia. The Persians had been subjects of the Medes, but under a king named Cyrus, they rebelled. They defeated the Medes. They conquered Lydia. They turned their attention to Babylon. Nabonidus returned to the city. He tried to organize a defense, but it was too late. Cyrus's army approached, and the city surrendered without a fight. There are different accounts of what happened. The Babylonian sources say Cyrus was welcomed as a liberator, that the people were tired of Nabonidus, that they opened the gates and invited the Persians in. Cyrus's own propaganda says the same thing. He claimed to be restoring proper worship of Marduk. He presented himself as the rightful king, chosen by the gods. Whether this is true or just spin is hard to say, but the result was clear. Babylon became part of the Persian Empire, and with that, Mesopotamian independence ended. For 3,000 years, the land between the rivers had been ruled by its own people: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. They had built cities and empires. They had created writing and law and literature. They had shaped civilization. Now they were subjects of a foreign power. The Persians ruled from Iran. Babylon was just one city among many in a vast empire. But the city endured. Cyrus treated it well. He restored the temples. He allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem. He presented himself as a benevolent ruler. His successors continued this policy. Babylon remained important. It was one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. The kings spent time there. They participated in the festivals. But it was no longer the center of the world. That had shifted east to Persia. The Babylonians adapted. They served in the Persian administration. They continued their religious practices. They maintained their culture. But something had changed. The creative energy that had driven Mesopotamian civilization for millennia was fading. The great building projects stopped. The literature became repetitive. The innovations ceased. The culture was being preserved but not developed. It was becoming a museum of itself. Still, for the people living in Babylon, life continued much as it had before. They worked. They raised families. They worshipped the gods. They told the old stories. At night, they looked up at the stars. Babylonian astronomers were the best in the world. They had been observing the heavens for centuries, recording the movements of planets, predicting eclipses, creating mathematical models of celestial motion. This knowledge would be passed on to the Greeks, to the Arabs, to the modern world. Babylonian astronomy would influence science for thousands of years. But the people doing this work didn't think of themselves as creating something for the future. They were just doing their jobs, observing, recording, calculating. The priests still performed the rituals. The statue of Marduk was still dressed and fed each day. The festivals still marked the turning of the seasons. But the god's power seemed diminished. He had not protected the city from conquest. He had not preserved Babylonian independence. Perhaps the gods were withdrawing. Perhaps the age of Mesopotamia was ending. In the small houses, in the narrow streets, people slept. They dreamed of the past, of the great kings, of the time when Babylon was the center of the world. But they woke to a different reality, to foreign rulers, to a world that was moving on. The rivers still flowed. The soil was still fertile. The sun still rose and set. The stars still wheeled overhead. But the world that had been built on these foundations was changing, slowly, inevitably. The night was long, and morning, when it came, would bring something new. Something that was no longer purely Mesopotamian. The age of independence was over, but the memory would remain. The stories would be told. The tablets would be buried in the ruins, waiting to be discovered thousands of years later. And in those tablets, the voices of the past would speak again, telling us who they were, what they believed, how they lived. For now, though, they slept. The last generation of independent Babylon, dreaming of glory, waking to change. The rivers kept flowing, the seasons kept turning, and the people kept going one day at a time, not knowing they were living through the end of an era, just living, as people always do. The Persian conquest was gentle, as conquests go. Cyrus didn't destroy Babylon. He didn't tear down the walls or burn the temples. He didn't massacre the population or enslave them. He presented himself as a liberator, not a conqueror. He issued a decree, recorded on a clay cylinder. It proclaimed that he had restored proper worship to the temples, that he had freed people who had been oppressed, that he ruled with the blessing of Marduk. This was propaganda, of course, but it was effective propaganda. It made Persian rule seem legitimate. It made resistance seem unnecessary. The Babylonians, for the most part, accepted it. They had been conquered before. They had survived. They would survive this too. Life continued. The markets still operated. The fields were still planted. The temples still functioned. The scribes still kept records. But the center of power had shifted. The important decisions were made in Persia now, not in Babylon. The tribute flowed east to the Persian capitals of Susa and Persepolis. Babylon became a provincial city. Important, yes. Wealthy, yes. But no longer independent. No longer the center of its own world. The Persian Empire was vast. It stretched from Egypt to India. It encompassed dozens of different peoples and cultures. The Persians ruled through a system of satrapies, provinces governed by appointed officials. Babylon was part of the satrapy of Babylonia. The satrap was usually a Persian, though he might employ Babylonian officials. The administration was bilingual. Documents were written in both Akkadian and Aramaic, which was becoming the common language of the empire. Aramaic was easier to write than cuneiform. It used an alphabet, not hundreds of different signs. It could be written quickly on papyrus or parchment, not laboriously pressed into clay. Gradually, Aramaic replaced Akkadian as the language of daily administration. Cuneiform continued to be used for religious texts and scholarly works, but it was becoming a specialized skill, known only to priests and scribes. The old language was dying, and with it, something of the old culture. The Persian kings visited Babylon occasionally. They participated in the New Year festival. They made offerings to Marduk. They maintained the fiction that they were legitimate Babylonian kings. But they were foreigners. They spoke Persian. They worshipped different gods. They had different customs. The Babylonians noticed this. They remembered when their own kings had ruled, when Babylon had been the center of the world, when Marduk had been supreme. There were occasional rebellions, attempts to restore Babylonian independence, but they were quickly suppressed. The Persian army was too strong. The empire was too well organized, and many Babylonians had adapted. They served in the Persian administration. They traded across the empire. They prospered under Persian rule. Why risk everything for independence when life was tolerable as it was? But there was a sense of loss, a feeling that something important had ended, that the great days were behind them. The temples continued their rituals. The priests still dressed the statues of the gods. They still performed the daily offerings. They still celebrated the festivals. But the crowds were smaller. The enthusiasm was less. The sense that the gods were present, that they cared about Babylon, was fading. Perhaps the gods had moved on. Perhaps they followed power, and power was now in Persia. The astronomers continued their observations. They recorded the movements of the planets with extraordinary precision. They developed mathematical models that could predict celestial events years in advance. This knowledge was valuable. The Persian kings consulted Babylonian astronomers. They wanted to know when eclipses would occur. They wanted to understand the omens in the sky. So the astronomers were supported. They had resources. They could continue their work. But they were working in isolation now. The broader culture that had produced them was fading. The schools were closing. The scribal tradition was weakening. Knowledge was being preserved, but not expanded. The creative period was over. Then, in 331 BCE, everything changed again. Alexander the Great arrived. Alexander was a Macedonian king who had conquered the Persian Empire. He had defeated the Persian armies in a series of battles. He had taken Egypt. He had marched through Syria and Mesopotamia. When he reached Babylon, the city surrendered without a fight. The Persian satrap handed over the keys. The people lined the streets to watch the conqueror enter. Alexander was young. He was charismatic. He was interested in everything. He wanted to learn about Babylonian culture. He consulted with the priests. He made offerings to Marduk. He ordered the restoration of temples that had fallen into disrepair. He planned to make Babylon one of the capitals of his empire. He began construction projects. He organized the administration. He seemed genuinely interested in the city's welfare. But then he died, suddenly, at the age of 32, in Babylon itself. The circumstances were mysterious: fever, possibly poison, possibly just bad luck. But the result was chaos. Alexander's empire fractured. His generals fought over the pieces. Mesopotamia eventually fell to Seleucus, who founded the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucids ruled from Syria. They were Greek in culture and language. They built new cities with Greek names. They promoted Greek customs and Greek religion. Babylon declined. The Seleucids built a new capital nearby, Seleucia on the Tigris. They moved the population there. They wanted a Greek city, not an ancient Mesopotamian one. Babylon was gradually abandoned. The temples fell into disrepair. The palaces crumbled. The great walls eroded. People still lived there, but in smaller numbers. The city that had once held hundreds of thousands now held only thousands, then hundreds. The cuneiform script was forgotten. The last dated cuneiform tablet was written in 75 CE. After that, no one could read the ancient writing. The knowledge preserved in thousands of tablets was lost. The temples were abandoned. The rituals ceased. The gods were forgotten or transformed into something else. Marduk became associated with Zeus, Ishtar with Aphrodite. The old names faded. The Euphrates changed course. It no longer flowed past the city. Without water, the irrigation systems failed. The fields turned to desert. The mud brick buildings dissolved in the rain. By the time of the Islamic conquest in the 7th century CE, Babylon was just a ruin, a mound of earth and broken bricks. Local people knew there had been a city there once, but they didn't know its history. The memory survived in other ways. In the Bible, Babylon was remembered as a place of exile and oppression. In Greek and Roman literature, it was remembered as a place of wonder and decadence. In Islamic tradition, it was associated with magic and ancient knowledge. But the real Babylon, the city of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, the city of ziggurats and cuneiform tablets, the city where civilization had flourished for 3,000 years, was forgotten. It would remain forgotten until the 19th century, when archaeologists began to excavate the ruins, when they learned to read cuneiform, when they discovered the tablets and translated them. And then, slowly, the ancient world came back to life. The voices of the dead spoke again. The stories were retold. The history was reconstructed. We know about Mesopotamia now. We know about the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. We know about their gods and their kings and their laws and their literature. We know because they wrote it down, because they pressed their words into clay, because clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, survives for thousands of years. The tablets were buried in the ruins. They waited in the darkness. And when they were finally found, they told their stories. Stories of people who lived and worked and loved and died, who built cities and empires, who created writing and law and literature, who looked up at the stars and tried to understand. They're gone now, all of them, the kings and the priests and the scribes and the farmers and the merchants and the slaves. Everyone who lived in Mesopotamia, everyone who walked those streets and slept in those houses and worshipped in those temples. Gone for thousands of years, but their words remain. Their stories remain. Their achievements remain. They created civilization. Not alone. Other cultures contributed too. But they were among the first. They showed what was possible. They demonstrated that humans could organize themselves on a large scale, that they could create complex societies, that they could preserve knowledge across generations. Everything that came after, Greece and Rome, the Islamic Golden Age, the Renaissance, the modern world, all of it built on foundations that were laid in Mesopotamia. The alphabet we use is descended from systems developed there. The mathematics we use has roots in Babylonian calculations. The astronomy we practice began with Mesopotamian observations. The laws we follow echo principles first articulated by Hammurabi. We are their heirs, whether we know it or not. The rivers still flow. The Tigris and the Euphrates still run through Iraq, through the land that was once Mesopotamia. The soil is still fertile, though the irrigation systems are different now. People still live there. They speak Arabic, not Akkadian. They worship differently. They have different customs and different concerns. But they live on the same land, under the same sky, by the same rivers. And sometimes, when archaeologists dig, they find the old tablets. They find the old walls. They find traces of the people who lived there thousands of years ago. And for a moment, the past and present touch. The ancient world becomes visible again. The voices speak, and we listen. We try to understand. We try to imagine what it was like to live in those times, to be part of that world. We can't fully succeed. Too much is lost. Too much is unknowable. We see through a glass darkly, as the saying goes. But we can try. We can read the tablets. We can study the ruins. We can piece together the fragments and create a picture, incomplete but real. And in doing so, we honor them, the people of Mesopotamia, the people who came before, who built the foundations on which we stand. They didn't know they were making history. They were just living, trying to survive, trying to make sense of the world, trying to leave something behind. And they succeeded. They left behind cities and tablets and stories. They left behind ideas and innovations. They left behind a legacy that endures. The night is long. The darkness is deep. But the stars still shine. The same stars they saw, the same patterns in the sky. And somewhere in the ruins, in the tablets, in the stories we tell, they still exist. Not as they were, but as memory, as history, as the foundation of everything that came after. The rivers keep flowing. The seasons keep turning. And the story continues, even though the people who started it are long gone. This is the end of ancient Mesopotamia, the end of independence, the end of an era. But it's not the end of the story, because the story continues in us, in what we remember, in what we've learned, in what we've built on their foundations. They sleep now, all of them, in the earth, in the ruins, in the past. But their words remain, their achievements remain, their legacy remains. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their stories, they're not entirely gone. They're here, in these words, in this history, in the long, slow arc of human civilization. The night is ending, dawn is coming. But before we leave, before we move on to other times and other places, we pause. We look back at the land between the rivers, at the cities that rose and fell, at the people who lived and died there. We remember them. We honor them. We acknowledge what they gave us. And then, quietly, we let them rest. The rivers keep flowing. The stars keep shining. And time moves on, as it always does, carrying us forward, into the future, away from the past. But the past remains, always, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be remembered, waiting to speak again. The story ends, but the rivers don't stop. They flow now as they flowed then, through the same land, under the same sky, carrying water from the mountains to the sea. The cities are gone. The empires are dust. The people who built them have been dead for thousands of years, but the rivers remain. And in that, there's something comforting, something that puts human ambition in perspective. We build, we create, we think we're making something permanent, but nothing human is permanent. Everything we make eventually crumbles, returns to the earth, becomes part of the soil that will nourish something else. The Mesopotamians knew this. They wrote about it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero searches for immortality and fails. He learns that death is inevitable, that the only immortality is in what you leave behind, in the stories people tell about you, in the children you raise, in the work you do. They understood that life is brief, that empires rise and fall, that even the greatest achievements are temporary. But they built anyway, they wrote anyway, they created anyway, because that's what humans do. We create meaning in the face of meaninglessness. We build order in the face of chaos. We tell stories in the face of silence. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those stories survive. Those creations endure. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever. But long enough to matter. Long enough to influence what comes after. Mesopotamia mattered. It shaped the world. It gave us tools and ideas that we still use. It showed us what was possible. And now, thousands of years later, we remember. We excavate the ruins. We translate the tablets. We tell the stories again. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Because we feel connected to those people across the vast gulf of time. Because their struggles and hopes and fears are recognizable. Human. They wanted what we want. Safety, prosperity, meaning. A sense that their lives mattered. That they were part of something larger than themselves. They found it for a time, in their cities, in their temples, in their families and communities, and then they died, as we all will, as everyone does. But the rivers kept flowing, the stars kept shining, and new people came, new stories began. This is the pattern. This is how it works. We live, we build, we pass on, and others take our place. It's not sad, exactly. It's just the way things are, the way they've always been, the way they'll always be, and there's a kind of peace in accepting that, in understanding that we're part of a long chain, that we're not the beginning or the end, just a link, a moment in a much longer story. The people of Mesopotamia are gone, but they were here. They lived. They mattered. And now, as you drift toward sleep, as your thoughts slow and your breathing deepens, you can let them go. Let them rest in the past, in the earth, in the long silence. The rivers are still flowing. The stars are still shining. And somewhere, far away, dawn is breaking over the land between the rivers. But you don't need to see it. You don't need to be there. You can rest now. You can sleep. The story is over. The history is told. And the night is quiet. The rivers keep flowing. Time keeps moving. And you, for now, can simply be. Still, quiet, at rest. The ancient world fades into darkness. The voices grow distant. The images blur and dissolve. And all that remains is the gentle sound of water. Flowing. Always flowing. Carrying everything away. Carrying everything forward. Into the darkness. Into the silence. Into sleep. Rest now. The rivers will still be there in the morning.